So let me just introduce who's here, and then we'll continue the conversation and start with people's reaction to what they just heard. So to my left, John Reese is the Downstream Policy and Advocacy Manager Americas with Shell Oil Products. He manages Shell's participation in the U.S. and Canadian regulatory issues that affect all of Shell's downstream businesses. Prior to joining Shell in 2002, he spent 10 years as an attorney with API, the American Petroleum Institute here in Washington. To his left is Michael Mcadam, president of the Advanced Biofuels Association, which represents more than 40 advanced biofuels production and feedstock companies. He has more than 30 years of experience in government and public affairs in the public and private sectors, working on all sorts of issues related to energy, fuel policy, climate change, air policy, tax. In the private sector, he worked in numerous roles, including 14 years for BP, where, among other roles, he was the Associate Group Policy Advisor to then CEO Lord Browne, and earlier in his career served as Legislative Director to a Republican congressman on the Hill after working as a field coordinator for President Carter, bipartisan approach to policy we don't see enough of anymore. Tom joined Growth Energy in March 2009 as the CEO of the organization. Prior to joining Growth Energy, he was elected to the National Farmers Union as its 13th president and has been with the organization since March 1998. And before that, served for nearly 5 years as the Senior Agricultural Policy Advisor to the Senate Majority Leader, Tom Daschle. And then Brendan McWilliams with AFPM, the American Fuel and Petroleum, American Fuel and Petrochemical Manufacturers, where he's the Executive Vice President, responsible for all their government relations, communications, regulatory affairs, and outreach. Has been with the association since 2007, and before that spent over 7 years on Capitol Hill. So, Brendan, let me start with you and sort of ask you really to respond to, the thing you maybe the thing you agreed most with and the thing you disagreed most was on the panel we just had, and then also just kind of get your reaction, AFPM's reaction to what EPA did 2 weeks ago.
Sure, I think starting to this. Okay, move it closer. Sure, I think starting with what EPA did 2 weeks ago, I think obviously, they did some things that moved in the right direction. I think they did some things that caused for concern. So I think that we were certainly happy to see them recognize the reality of the blend wall and reflect that to a certain extent in 2014 and 2015. I think we are concerned about moving past the blend wall in 2016, which was what was discussed on the previous panel. In terms of going to the first part of your question second, what did I disagree with most? I think one of the fundamental flaws in this debate rests in the fact that there's a misunderstanding about the nature of the mandate. This is very much, and Bob McNally said it, it's a demand mandate. It's a demand for all of you to put something in your tank, a mixture of fuel that the government deems you should put in your tank. And it really relies on what consumers demand in the marketplace. The obligated party, the refiner, doesn't own or operate the infrastructure to sell that product to consumers. Over 97% of retail infrastructure is independently owned and operated, and they're small businesses, and they have to make independent decisions about whether or not they're going to spend upwards of $200,000 to put in a pump for a product that people may or may not want. And you don't have to take our word for it. If you talk to the associations that represent the retailers, they'll tell you the exact same thing. And in a letter to Congress, PMAA actually said they addressed this fallacy that the oil industry is somehow holding back on investing in infrastructure. PMAA, whose members are again independently owned and operated, said that it's not anything to do with oil companies. It's a lack of consumer demand that is preventing more E85 from hitting the marketplace. Consumers just don't want it. You've had all this discussion about pricing E85. I just checked today, the energy adjusted content for 85 is more costly than regular gasoline. And I think that speaks to the fact that, Ron Mintz touched on the last panel, which was that, if you look at the program in reality, it's not really operating how it's supposed to operate in practice. And I think that really, speaks to this kind of disallocation between the mandate requiring consumers to purchase something and where the obligated party lies.
So just to close on that, what's the one or two kind of top things you guys will be kind of providing in the comment period where you think the biggest changes are needed?
Well, I think our concern is obviously 2016. Obviously 2016, as was indicated in the previous panel, you bust through the blend wall based on the projections we know today. And they have ranges, but I think about 75 million gallons of E85 were sold. One of the compliance pathways EPA laid out, they did have a range. One of them was upwards of 600 million gallons. And there are some serious infrastructure challenges with trying to achieve that kind of growth in a product. And from our perspective, again, since we don't own or operate the infrastructure, the compliance mechanism is RINs. Particularly if you're a merchant refiner, but even refiners that have blending capabilities, could find themselves RINs short. And RINs essentially operate as a permit to offer gasoline and diesel into the market. Like, you can't get enough RINs, it limits the supply you can offer. And so our big concern is if you're going through the blend wall and a lot of these things that need to happen to meet the mandate don't pan out, then are you going to be able to get enough credits to comply with the program? And so our comment is going to be, again, I think we're happy to see the recognition of the blend wall in 2014. I think we're happy to see in 2015. 2016 is, we are concerned that they're pushing past the blend wall, and a lot of that is going to depend on a lot of uncertainty in the marketplace. And so I think our comments are really going to focus on those elements, as well as several other details in the rule that take a lot longer to go into.
Tom, same question for you about your reaction to what EPA did, and then also just this point about sort of the market for how much ethanol there is. You presumably have a different view. Can you talk a little bit about why, what people on the kind of the other side are getting wrong about that?
Sure, and I'm glad to see they brought us clean glasses for that ethanol I'm going to feed or provide for all our oil friends here. We obviously disagree, and I think if you really stop and look at this law and the goals of the law and the progress of the law thus far, it's working. Where we ran into the bobble and the trouble and the major hurdle was when the obligated parties decide we're not going to live up to the obligation, we're not going to start blending higher blends, which even though the days of during the passage of in 2017 of ISA, the projections of consumption were higher, everyone knew that at some point in the future we were going to have higher blends in the market to meet the goals of the RFS. No two ways about it. Did we get it there earlier? Yeah, had the most severe economic recession in any of our lifetimes in the country. Investment lenders went to the sidelines. EPA didn't get the rules out on the RFS 2 for a couple of years. It took a while to get that out there to create, all the programs and how people were going to participate. And then just as we started to come out of the recession, it came out slowly. It just didn't affect our industry. It affected all industries in investment and lending. Just as we started, then basically a year and a half ago, EPA blanked. And they let the obligated parties out of their obligation to blend higher blends. We hear all this rhetoric, and a lot of it's rhetoric. We started in 2007 and 2008 when a trade association here in Washington hired one of the best PR firms to create what I consider the biggest lie I've ever heard in Washington. I've been here nearly 30 years, and that was food versus fuel. Has no legitimacy in fact. Made for a great way to bring down support for biofuels, and in fact ethanol. And if anyone really needs a lesson on how that food versus fuel stuff works, in a 30-second soapbox response here, the only thing taken out of the kernel of corn is the starch. We have an excess of starch in the world. All the good stuff in a kernel of number 2 yellow corn, and number 2 yellow corn is animal corn. It's not sweet corn, canned corn, popcorn, or candy corn. It's what we feed the animals. all the protein, fiber, and oil gets returned into a co-product called distillers' grains. We've expanded the amount of feed available for replacing number 2 yellow corn worldwide. So that was the first big lie. We've seen all this stuff. Your car's going to break down. Maybe your hair's going to fall out. Your teeth are going to rot. It's not based on fact. And this whole fight is about market share. Plain and simple. We took 10% of the market that I don't think people ever thought we'd get there that quick. If EPA sticks to their guns on the RFS, we have the capability of taking more market share. Let the consumer make the choice at the pump. Remove the barriers. The RFS does that.
And so just to make sure I understand what that means, in your view, therefore, the idea that there's a high RIN price that acts as sort of a cross-subsidy where it raises the price of diesel or gasoline, it lowers the price of E85 and ethanol-based fuels. Your view of it is that is what the RFS was in fact designed to do. The idea that there's a blend wall, the whole purpose of the RFS is to build out the infrastructure it takes to get past that so we can put more ethanol into the fuel supply.
In essence, it's a market access document or program, the RFS. Our friends on the other side like to say, we don't own the retail outlets, but they are controlled by contractual arrangements. We face all types of barriers. We're all for free enterprise. We're all for free competition. We don't have any tax breaks. We don't have any import barriers. We want access to that consumer. Let them make the choice. In the areas where they have offered E15, which is a far greater opportunity than higher blends at this time, you're seeing consumers react by buying more E15. It's cheaper, it's cleaner, it's better performing.
John, you're an obligated party, so you're buying the RINs. What's wrong with what you just heard Tom say? You buy the RINs. We heard on the last panel that you're able to pass that cost of the higher RIN price on to the people who buy your unfinished gasoline. You can tell us if that's true or not, and that provides the incentive to build out more capacity to take more ethanol. What's the problem in your view?
So let me tell you a little bit about Shell. We actually wear a lot of hats under this program. We are an obligated party. We manufacture gasoline, supply it to the United States. We also earn terminals and we blend biofuels, both biodiesel and ethanol. We're really an innovator in ethanol in the United States. We innovated on the whole unit train concept to move ethanol efficiently from the Midwest out to California at first and then in other areas of the country. We have a joint venture where we actually produce ethanol, and we're trying to commercialize cellulosic biofuels. So we have a lot of hats that we wear in this program. Our position on this, I've been talking about this now for 2.5 years, is that we've generally supported the RFS because we do wear all these hats, but we feel that it has to be fixed, and it has to be fixed. The mandates have to line up with the ability of the infrastructure and the fuels to consume the fuels. Brendan's right. The RINs act as permits to supply gasoline and diesel to the United States. When you boil this law right down to its very core, that's what it does. It limits the supply of gasoline and diesel to the United States by the consumption of renewable fuels. I could show you the math if you wanted to see it, but that's what the law does. So there's a real concern if the law tries to go too far, too fast, and tries to require too many RINs than actually can be biofuels can be consumed. And there's some real disconnects here in the law. And it's not as easy as folks say. You say, well, okay, well, just consume more biofuels and you'll have more RINs. Well, 97% of all retail gasoline stations are actually owned by independent third parties, and they would have to be the ones who would have to decide to offer those fuels. E85, they can do that. There's a law. As a matter of fact, there was a provision in ESA of 2007 that basically said contracts under PMPA could not prohibit the sale of E85. So they could do that. There's Shell stations that actually offer E85. But it's up to the retailer to make that decision, right? And it's a pretty large investment for that small retailer. Now, E15, that's a different issue because of the incompatibility, not only with the retail infrastructure, but also with the cars. So EPA said that it was okay for 2001 and newer cars. The problem is that the automobile manufacturers do not agree with that. And there was a study done by the automobile manufacturers and the oil through a group called the Coordinating Research Council. And these were tests that were designed by the automobile manufacturing engineers. that showed that E85 damaged the vehicles. So there's a real concern about the E15 liability, and that's probably why you don't see that. So there's a lot of disconnects in this law that really have to be fixed, we believe. And I guess while I got the floor, I'll just say, so what did I like about EPA's proposal? I think they actually got a lot right in this proposal. Taking this step to address this blend wall was important, okay? And I think that they knew that they were going to get the kind of reaction they're getting from certain stakeholders, but they did it anyways. Why? Well, because they really had to, because it would have a negative impact on consumers and the economy, and also the long-term viability of this program. I think Mr. Stock recently in a Reuters article suggested that these folks that are arguing for just going back for the to the statutory levels were putting the program at risk. It really plays into the hands of just eliminating the program. I think there's an important aspect of this program that hasn't been talked about yet, and that is if you look at the percent reductions of the different buckets, EPA is actually now providing a mechanism to take this program forward and provide certainty, because the reduction in the general renewable and the advanced pools exceed 20% in 15 and 16. Therefore, there's a provision in the law, it's called the reset provision. Once they either reduce a mandate by 50% in 1 year or 20% in 2 years, they are then obligated to reset the volumes in the law out through 2022. And so this is a way for EPA to actually provide a longer-term view to folks. You were talking on the earlier panel about, so you got these numbers, but you're thinking about investing in cellulosic. What kind of certainty do you have? Well, you've got very little certainty right now in the near term. So EPA is going to get this rule done by the end of the year. We're hearing a lot about litigation from the ethanol interest. That creates uncertainty through 2016. And then at the same time, EPA is going to be working on this reset. Maybe by the time they get through that reset, we actually have some certainty longer term out to 2022 of what this program looks like.
So just to close, on the prior panel, we heard about the degree of uncertainty, the question about what comes after 2016, even how many RINs there might be out there. How do you plan your business as an obligated party?
Well, it's really hard. I mean, and if you look back at last year, the best thing you had to do, or you could do, is probably look at EPA's proposal. And, and every company will look at that differently, and you make judgments. But some people probably got disappointed by that, I think especially by the biodiesel number, because there's a provision in the law that says that EPA cannot change that biodiesel number unless they finalize it 14 months in advance of the year that it applies. So today, that means not until I think it's 2017, if I do the math right. And yet they changed it in 2014. So probably some folks, might have been disappointed by that. But the best you can do now today is probably look at the proposal that they put out, and then you can make some judgments for next year based on what they did this year and stuff. But it's all very uncertain. But I don't know how you go really out any farther than that. I think this whole reset mechanism is going to really tell us that. It's going to tell us what the numbers are all the way out to 2022.
Michael, let me turn to you. If folks read Jim Stock's paper, and I hope they do, the executive summary is outside. You can find the whole paper on our website. It's motivated by, as he said, this is the policy tool we have. Let's make it work better, with the goal, in his view, I don't want to speak for him, if we can, figure out how the fuel system can take more ethanol and then make progress toward advanced and second generation ethanol. And that was a core purpose of the law originally. And you look at those dramatic escalating volumes, which we haven't seen yet. So, or tell me if that's wrong. From your standpoint, how do you view the outlook for second generation biofuels, and when can we start to see them come into the system if we build out the infrastructure to absorb more ethanol?
Well, first of all, I want to say it's not all about ethanol all the time. And so we've just spent an hour and 60 minutes talking about ethanol and how we're going to cram the last 600 million gallons of ethanol into the gasoline pool. That's what we've just done for 2 hours. I represent the industry that makes drop-in fuels. Those are fuels that are identical in nature to those that come from a barrel of oil through a refinery. I have one of my largest members right here, Neste, who makes 700 million gallons of renewable diesel that can be used neat in 100% form. Can be totally fungible in the pipelines, totally usable in military vehicles. I have other members who make jet fuel that have been flown on the F-18s off the deck of the Nimitz. I got to watch it myself. And so what we have is we have a disconnect between what the Congress clearly said was one of their most important goals in the 2007 bill, which was to build a 21 billion gallon advanced and cellulosic industry, and we have not delivered it. Instead, today we've spent all day talking about the 15 billion gallons and whether or not they're going to get it. And they sold 15 billion gallons last year because the 70% of America's gasoline market currently uses 10% ethanol to hit the octane rating. So we're talking about how much more do we have to give the generation of fuels that's already been built, instead of the generation we should be looking at a time when the EPA is announcing standards for jets moving forward to address climate change. We've exempted boats under the RFS on the oceans, and now we're also looking at heavy-duty engines, off-road engines, and big trucks. So if we're going to tackle climate change, the only way to tackle climate change is to use the fuels that actually had a climate change mandate and who didn't in 2007 go in and grandfather themselves out from under any greenhouse gas reduction requirements. Those are the people that I represent. And they do want to build plants, and they can't because the existing law doesn't have the framework for them to build new plants. And the uncertainty created between the harangue of the existing oil industry and the existing corn industry has put a black cloud over the people I've represented to the point where they're about to run out of gas and call it a day. So we have called for the Congress to step up. Clearly, there are issues that need to be reviewed. We do not really know what's going to happen after 2022. To John's point, if we see a reset that is significant, what does that mean for advanced biofuels? What does that mean for the banker who wants to loan the money? If we don't see more cellulosic fuels coming in the market who can actually get bought because the waiver credit allows my colleague to my right to choose a waiver credit in Brazilian ethanol to hit the nesting instead of actually buy the fuel my guys make, how are we going to get there to deliver these 60 to 80% reduction clean fuels that the nation wants and both sides of the aisle support? And I'll stop there.
So is it was helpful to focus on the advanced biofuels and not just ethanol, but I mean, is it you're talking about the barriers that folks in industry have put up to the deployment and development of advanced biofuel, but do you think it's reasonable for some people who look back on what Congress did in 2007 and say, we hope this stuff would materialize, and we're just nowhere close? So we just have to rethink, like...
Some of the barriers are the way the EPA has had to try to implement the RFS. With all due respect, I worked for President Carter, and we had an ethanol tax credit in 1978. We didn't really have advanced biofuels coming into the market until 2006, 2007, in that time frame. So we're the new kids on the block. We're in our infancy. But when you try to get a pathway for a new fuel, try it. There's 29 outstanding. They've been outstanding now for an average of 2 years and 9 months. You can't even get the new fuel under the program. Why in the world would the bank loan you the money to build the plant when EPA hasn't stepped forward and said, oh yeah, we meant for you to be under the program? Yet the definitions in the program are so constrained and so limiting that the staff of EPA says, oh, well, you really need to go change the definition of wood or change the definition of waste or change the definition of biogenic oil so that we can have a clear, no-risk policy from being sued over here in order to put you under the program. So, I mean, that's just one example, but I could give you multiple examples of things such as the intermediate feedstock co-location issue right now that is in the current rules. We need the administration to step up and actually implement the program on the advanced and cellulosic side in a more efficient manner. And I know they're trying to do that.
Tom, yeah.
Yeah, I think Mike hit a sore spot, I think, for a lot of us on how this program has been implemented. I may disagree on whether or not it takes legislation. I think it takes willpower at EPA to make this thing work. Growth Energy, we represent roughly 90 ethanol plants, including a number of which are producing cellulosic ethanol commercially. Poet out in Project Liberty, Quad County. We've got other plants in Colorado that are looking at wood waste, all kinds of different products. And we're just as frustrated with the lack of progress that we've seen there. and how we move forward, you know, I got to tell you, I worked up there. I worked in the House. I worked in the Senate. And you may have a hell of a lot more confidence around this panel than I do that Congress can get it right. They are doing right now what they do best, which is nothing. And they certainly, I don't want them trying to micromanage the market because it's only going to get worse. I think, as Dr. Babcock mentioned, the RIN markets were working. Again, we just need a little willpower at EPA. The other thing on the uncertainty, and that's the key thing, Mike hit the nail on the head. People aren't going to invest the hundreds of millions of dollars to build a next-generation biorefinery. We've already seen that in the cellulosic industry. Every major commercial cellulosic plant is being built by corn ethanol plants, existing corn ethanol plants. They've all said they're not going to build any more for the lack of certainty. And what EPA did with this rule, even though it's a little better than the previous attempt, which was as bad as it could be from our perspective, all they've done here is they tickled the blend wall. They didn't crash through the blend wall. And with all due respect, if you look at the numbers and the surplus RINs, we're not going to see the blend wall broken.
Brendan, I want you to respond to that, and then do you? I mean that policy objective. If we want to reduce emissions, we want to reduce oil imports. That there's a role for government to try to make advanced second-generation biofuels happen. Do you agree with that? And then we can talk about how to do it and whether the RFS is the right tool or not. But is that a good policy objective?
I think if you want to diversify the energy supply generally, you're going to have to develop a fuel that consumers want to buy and is cost competitive on the market. And I think there's a role for, you know, a certain amount of research, development, technology advancement. I think the problem is with the RFS, you're mandating arbitrary volumes that were set at a time at which the energy picture looked completely different than it does now. We were talking about energy scarcity in 2007. Now we're talking about energy abundance. And as everybody's alluded to, these are volumetric requirements. And at the same time we're talking about energy abundance, we're also seeing consumption, gasoline demand, motor fuel, liquid transportation fuel demand, flat if not slightly declining domestically for the foreseeable future. So I think it all speaks to the fact that, as several folks have highlighted, this policy isn't operating as intended and is, you know, if not addressed, you know, for the reasons John and I mentioned earlier, could have a detrimental impact to consumers. I mean, if consumers wanted this, there would be a market for it, and you wouldn't need a mandate for it. The cable industry, you know, didn't decide to mandate that the broadcasters go out and pay for all this infrastructure to deliver television products to people. You know, they said, hey, people want this. There's a market for it. We're going to put in the money because, you know, we know there's demand there. The problem with this mandate goes back to the fact that it's a consumer mandate. If people don't want to buy it, how are you supposed to meet it? You know, go back to the retail point. There's 150,000 retail stations. You know, on the franchise contract thing, I just echo what John said in relation to the provision in Nissan E85. But half of those stations aren't even franchised. You know, it sounds like if the RFS is so great and RINs are such a value, you know, I would ask why big segments of the ethanol industry aren't out there buying stations, building pumps for people to, you know, to drive up to and fill up, if that's the case. But that's not happening. As I've said, the marketers themselves had said they have problems actually selling 85 because of consumer demand. So the whole structure of this program really doesn't get at any of the policy objectives that were originally laid out.
I'll venture one editorial comment, which I've resisted to date. But, I mean, Jim said to maintain his membership in the American Economic Association, who's sort of pointed out externalities aren't priced, like national security externalities of oil import dependence or carbon. So does that, I mean, that relates to your point that consumers don't want it. Partly it's because we haven't internalized the social costs of energy consumption. Is that fair?
Well, if you want to address, you know, externalities, I think as several folks have done, the bottom line is the RFS ain't cutting it. I think there's lots of questions over whether or not you have environmental benefits from the mandated use of ethanol. And one of the members of the audience actually raised the question, highlighted data, which I think is arguable. So I think when push comes to shove, though, any policy you implement has to be rooted in reality. And what we're finding is that if the RFS for the long term isn't adjusted, it is going to completely divorce itself from reality. And going back to what I mentioned before, I think we were certainly happy that EPA recognized the blend wall. We are concerned that they're looking to push through it next year. But the volumes in the statute keep increasing through 2022. So moving, limping year to year to decide how we're going to address this problem isn't going to solve anybody's concerns from a policy perspective.
John, do you want to comment on that issue of second-generation biofuels? And then I'm also curious your view on sort of how the changes in the oil market, the oil price collapse, potential increases on demand, how does that change your sort of view on where this policy might be headed?
So, Shell, we're pretty supportive of action to reduce, CO2 emissions to address climate change. So we've been very interested in the cellulosic biofuels and have been working towards trying to make them commercial for a long time. Some of the things that EPA does in this proposal are supportive of the cellulosic effort. Mike mentioned the cellulosic waiver credit. Now, here's a real wonky kind of thing, but the law specifies the value of the credit exactly. It says whenever EPA adjusts the mandates in the law, they shall issue credits, and they shall be 25 cents or the difference between $3 and the wholesale price of gasoline, whichever is greater, adjusted for inflation. When EPA put in the rules, they said if you have to buy one of these cellulosic waiver credits from EPA, it doesn't count towards advanced, et cetera. So Mike alluded to this, but basically the value of cellulosic is determined by the advanced credit plus the cellulosic waiver credit. It kind of determines the value of cellulosic, and that's what they're competing against. And so by actually the philosophy of EPA here of focusing, I think correctly, the structure of the law is cellulosic displaces advanced, displaces general renewable to have kind of the greatest greenhouse gas benefit. I think EPA's philosophy in this rule of kind of increasing the advanced pool sum is consistent with that structure of the law, but it's also supportive of the cellulosic effort as well. So then on your second point about oil prices, things like that, well, I mean, that goes to biofuels have a difficulty sometimes competing against fossil fuels, and that's why you need a mandate in a way, because if well, let's take ethanol for example. Ethanol, if it is economic versus gasoline, it's an economic source of octane, it will be used for octane. I would submit to you that if the RFS went away tomorrow, the amount of corn ethanol blended into gasoline probably wouldn't change because it's needed for octane, the infrastructure is in place, et cetera, and it's an economic choice. Now, that all changes when you go above the blend wall, but I'm talking about below the blend wall. The thing about cellulosic and advanced, I mean, their economics are more challenged, and so lower oil prices probably make that competition more difficult. So I guess I'll stop there.
I want to open it up to the audience, but just quick, one other question. I'm just curious, Mike or Tom, how important the $100 million USDA infrastructure fund is. Does that have a big impact?
Well, we welcomed the decision by Secretary Vilsack. He is the Secretary of Agriculture, not the EPA administrator, but I think it's a good program. But if you look at the enormity of the challenge to get biofuels, higher blends into the marketplace, it's going to take a long time with those kind of rates. You got 150-some thousand retail outlets out there. That's the slow way. And I don't want people to think that that's a good excuse for EPA not doing and sticking with the RFS as they should have. But I commend Secretary Vilsack. We have, in the ethanol industry, our own effort, and it's been working. We're starting to see a lot of major independents move to E15. And despite all the advertising, all the rhetoric, and all the false information that gets spread out there that this is not good for your car, we happen to believe it is. DOE's testing versus that CRC testing was 86 vehicles versus 8. And 2 of those 8 that CRC tested, 1 had been recalled. They didn't test E10 fuel, which is the fuel of today. We all know it's in virtually almost every gallon. They tested it, E15 and E20 against E0. 6 million miles of testing in the lab, 7 million miles of testing on one of the toughest proving grounds in NASCAR, and now millions of gallons in the real world by consumers who are choosing E15 without any problems. So, you know, we can talk till the cows come home about whether E85. E15 is 85% of all the vehicles in the car park can use it. Over 90% of the fuel consumption. And the other side can talk about warranties all they want. How many people have a car over 7 years old or 5 years old that still has an existing warranty? The automakers are starting to build the cars for E15. It's the low-hanging fruit. We just want the opportunity to be able to offer it at the marketplace.
So I want to open it up. Did you have something quickly on that?
Just,
Okay.
we all know the automobile manufacturers can make cars that are compatible with E15. They've been doing it for years. E85 vehicles, flex fuel vehicles, are compatible with E15. And now some manufacturers are putting vehicles on the road that are compatible with E15. You can make NASCARs compatible with E15. The problem is they did not make the cars from 2001 up till now compatible with E15. It's a backwards compatibility issue. So comparing this to NASCAR or to flex fuel vehicles is just not a good comparison at all.
John, I respectfully disagree. I think that's BS.
Questions, and please, identify yourself and please keep the question brief. Right over here.
Hi, I'm Doug Faulkner with Leather Stocking Consulting. Kind of thinking about long-term trends in the liquid fuels markets, how much longer do we need a biofuels mandate, whether it's the renewable fuel standard or something else, and why?
Well, I'll tackle that, Doug. Let me do that through kind of an analog, right? So if you all want to go buy a house, you want to get a loan, you want to take a 30-year loan so that you can afford to pay for your house. And if I want to go build a $500 million cellulosic plant, then I'm going to need a loan and I'm going to need a runtime on it. And that's one of the problems we have right now in the advanced sector, because the statute's through 2022, and then it's kind of up to EPA what happens after that. And we've all talked about politics today, and I have a tendency to agree with Bob's assessment of where the politics is at the moment. And in terms of overall biofuels generally, it's not as strong as it used to be in 2007 or 2005. So our guys are having a hard time having new capital to come in to build drop-in fuel plants or cellulosic plants because the banks only think they're going to have 7 years to finance them.
Sorry, did you want to?
So not all the answers to that are in the RFS. I mean, one thing like the production tax credit, there is a production tax credit for cellulosic ethanol, or cellulosic biofuels, let me say, but it's really dysfunctional because it's a year at a time, extended a year at a time, in arrears. So no one can, in arrears, right? So no one can make any decisions based on that. If you wanted that to actually work, you would have to take a more forward-looking, longer kind of approach to that.
I mean, the banks won't even give you credit for it when you go to file your paperwork because it's on again, off again.
Other questions? I can keep asking questions. Sure.
I'm curious as to why ActionAid and Oxfam are lobbying against the corn ethanol portion of the renewable fuel standard if it isn't impacting food prices. The National Research Council found that RFS was a significant contributor to food price spikes in 2008 and 2009, as do many other people. So I think, renewable fuels that can reduce greenhouse gas emissions that are good for the environment, everyone wants that. I'm an environmental scientist, I want that. But currently, the RFS needs to be revisited.
I guess that was aimed at me.
You're astute.
If we drove up the price of food, right, and the price of corn got to $8 in 2012, not because of the RFS mandate. It was called that little lady called Mother Nature. And we had the worst drought in our nation's history maybe even worse than during the Dust Bowl. We still had the 6th biggest crop of corn on history that year, but still, it drove up prices. They got to $8 a bushel. People blame corn and corn ethanol for driving up the price. Today, corn is trading for $3.20 a bushel. Have food prices come down? No, they haven't. They have not. And again, this is for livestock feed. This is not what humans eat. You have very few direct food uses for number 2 yellow corn. Matter of fact, how many people have had a ear of number 2 yellow corn this summer? Any hands? No. That's not what you eat. We've had 2 record corn crops in a row. Food prices are not coming down. We can't be blamed. I have as many studies, more studies than you do, from more objective sources, including the World Bank, who said, quote unquote, the biggest cause of food price increase is the price of oil. 50% of that price increase. They didn't say ethanol.
What? Well, we can see why it's so hard to build consensus on this when basic facts like whether it's affecting food price, whether it's good for CO2, who pays for the RIN price, all of those things are not even agreed upon. So next time we do this, we're honored that EIA in the form of Adam Szyminski and Howard Grunspector here. I'm not going to put them on the spot now, but next time we'll ask them to present and they can answer all those questions for us because I'm sure they've analyzed all of those things and more. I'll ask another question unless there are others in the interim. But the sort of debate was not only what number EPA came out with, but the methodology they used and the use of the general waiver authority, the kind of argument that, there's insufficient supply because we don't have anywhere to put it. I just want people to sort of comment on when you look out beyond 2016, if that kind of continues to be what does that signal for where the policy might be headed, and what are people's thoughts on EPA's use of that?
I think obviously EPA's decision to use the authority it clearly has is, as I mentioned earlier, was one of the positive elements of what they did and a recognition of reality. You mentioned the out years, and I think that is one of the challenges with this program is that because the volumes were set at a time where our energy landscape was different and gasoline demand, motor fuels demand, was projected to go up, ad nauseum. That's not the case today, and that highlights one of the challenges of this, having to do this program from a year-to-year basis, and is just another reason why we think it should either be scrapped or revisited.
Well, but let me say, with this reset, though, there's another mechanism here. Right, so this year they have to do the general waiver authority. In 2017, they have to use the general waiver authority. But at the same time, they're going to be doing this reset rulemaking to lower down the volumes to, I think, workable levels. And so by the time we get to about 2018, maybe there's no need at all to make any adjustments based on general waivers, et cetera, because they will have already gone through the process in this reset of establishing levels that are actually feasible.
Yeah, and let's give them credit where credit's due. I mean, if you had to put your hat on anybody in this room and take the job of Chris Grundler and his staff, looking at the differences that were just expressed here today, you'd have probably try to come down in the middle somewhere too. And what they did that was very bright was they took the actual used gallons for 14, and that's what they plan to do on 15. So you're going to have a grounded number that's a real number, not a fictional number. 16 is debatable because we're not in 16, right? But by the time they set this number in November, we're going to have 11 of the 12 months worth of numbers. We're going to be within spitting distance.
So looking to go ahead.
Touch on that. When Congress debated this, there was a provision in the House that took in inadequate demand. It got dropped. It never became part of the law. And Congress clearly addressed the issue. They addressed it in conference. And again, I think you can hear from the banner up here today. I mean, we're already talking about resetting. We're talking about rewriting. The EPA clearly sided with the obligated parties in proposing this rule. Not as much as they did the first one, but they certainly still lean that way.
So, John, let me ask you. We talked on the last panel and on this one about the view from some that we heard today that if the policy is working, you in fact do have a high RIN price. That in fact is what creates the incentive and is the tax and subsidization policy. That's how you bring it about. So as someone who's an obligated party who has to pay that high price, but who nonetheless is sympathetic to the goals that the policy is trying to achieve, is that right to you? I mean, if we see a high RIN price, is the policy working or is it not working?
Well, but there's big disconnects in the law. So we a couple years ago wrote letters to different committees up at Capitol Hill that were looking at this issues, et cetera, and we said then, and it's true now, if RINs prices stayed high enough long enough, they would probably result in some E85 expansion. The problem is what else happens in the meantime, right? And there was a lot made of this EPA memo, what was the gentleman's name? Memo, where it kind of talked about gasoline price impacts, but then it also mentioned diesel impacts in passing. So in the diesel, where you don't blend as much renewable fuel in, so the impact of the blend, well, it's very strange, wonky people understand this, but we talk about it as ethanol and gasoline, and that is the issue, but the impact is really first seen in diesel. Okay, so there's a big economic impact, and I heard a lot of discussion this morning about, retailers would, if the RIN price is just high enough, et cetera, they might do and stuff. RIN, the retailers are independently owned and operated, and there is a lag time there between the point where they decide to do that. And in the meantime, if there's a shortage of RINs, the first thing you see is the RIN price go up, and that starts to have impacts on supply. But then you really get into trouble if the mandates are too high, where there's just not even enough RINs. And that would be the biggest kind of concern of just jumping right back to statutory levels. Because remember what Brandon said, which is true. I mean, RINs are effectively permits to supply gasoline and diesel to the United States. And I've heard it said in the past where people would say, well, then, obligated parties have to pay penalties. Well, we're not allowed to knowingly violate the law and just pay penalties. What we have we have a name for people that do that in the United States, who knowingly violate the Federal Clean Air Act and just pay penalties. Anybody want to guess what it is? Yes. Okay, so we can't do that. We have to take action to remain in compliance with the law, and that's where a big problem would occur.
Was there a question? Sorry, go ahead. No, there's a microphone right here.
Hi, it's Kevin Adler from Oil Price Information Service. I was talking with some people from National Renewable Energy Lab recently, and they seem to think that the critical mass for convenience for consumers to buy E85 is 20% of the gas stations having it. That's the number that they've come up with from some surveys they've done. What do you guys think of that number, and what would it take to get to 20% of the gas stations offering E85?
It's going to take a lot. If you stop and think about, there's roughly 3,000 stations offering E85 out of 150,000. That's going to take quite an effort. And I just want to say something about E85. There are 18 million vehicles. That's fine. They're scattered all over the country. And I heard one of the panelists up here saying, well, if you do this concentration. The second challenge you have with the flex fuel vehicle issue is that EPA and DOT has taken away the incentive for automobile manufacturers to build more E85 flex fuel vehicles out there in the marketplace. The low-hanging fruit, again, is E15. 85% of the vehicles, 90% of the fuel consumed, and that's where we move the needle. A little bit down the road, I think you may have an opportunity for an EXX, I don't know, 25 or 30 that engines are designed for. Obviously, lower displacement of the engines, higher compression, turbocharging direct injection requires higher octane. Ethanol is 113 octane. We're the cheapest source of octane in the world. Then you may be able to see a higher blend. E85 has not had the results that everyone wanted because, one, it's not priced right, and two, the very limited amount of infrastructure and limited amount of vehicles.
Yeah, go ahead.
In defense of EPA a little bit here, and also I think DOT, the law took away the flexible fuel vehicle credit. It's in the ESA 2007, phases it out. So it's not something that EPA or any other agency of the government has done. It's actually in the law.
However, EPA has yet to provide the guidance to the automakers on what they want to see to meet the remaining incentives based on consumption. So you can't just blame Congress, and as Mike just mentioned over and over again, there's a lot of the RFS that we never see. We never see the pathways. We never see this
For
stuff.
instance, okay, you want to talk about penetration in the gasoline pool today? We need an E15 waiver for isobutanol, which you could blend in at 16%. There's a recent report that came, that's a drop in fuel, okay? There's a recent report came out that said probably the best fuel you could put in the existing fleet is 82% gasoline, 15% ethanol, 7% butanol. But you can't, because the regs are set up around the Clean Air Act, particularly for non-attainment areas, okay? You can't blend butanol in to an existing tank with any ethanol in it because it won't have 10% ethanol. And you have to have 10% ethanol to get the 1 pound waiver. So you blow the RVP spec. Okay, I know I'm in the weeds, but I mean, there are all these little barriers to entry that if what we were talking about, and the other comment I would say in terms of Tom's point about higher blends of fuel, that's a longer-term energy question relative to climate change. That's a much longer time horizon. I just got to participate in an event with Harvard with Jim. You're looking at all kinds of competition in 2030 or 2035 in terms of what pathways are best for overall delivering the nation's fuel efficiency, climate change reductions, and fueling structure. So
Although
I mean,
they do have to meet it by 2025.
Right. Yeah.
We have to wrap up, but I'm curious if we can end on any kind of areas of common ground. So, and Brendan, I'm curious if in your view is the reform of the RFS one that basically has to keep it under the blend wall, or if we were to see advances in second generation biofuels, is there a structure? Is there something EPA could do that would allow for the deployment of more ethanol into the system that nonetheless you think would sort of make sense from a policy standpoint?
I think if we're talking just about ethanol specifically, there are a lot of challenges. I'm going to agree with Tom on the mounting challenges of E85. I think there we go. Rare moment. But, I think, so what USDA's grant was $100 million. They wanted to double the number of stations, so you're going from 2% to 4%. So if you break it down, it's like $33,000 a station when it could cost up to $200,000 to put a new pump, for these small business retailers. So there are a lot of challenges there. I think, we have clearly articulated from our perspective all the challenges with the RFS, as have many of the stakeholders engaged in the debate. And I think, everything that's come up today highlights why we still believe the current structure of the RFS is broken and isn't going to work for the long term, which is, Congress passed this law. Congress has the power to ensure that we don't have adverse consumer impacts for the fuel supply, and they've heard from all the stakeholders. If you want a solution to the RFS, whether it be avoiding adverse consumer impacts or any kind of long-term policy for fuel supply diversification, the answer isn't within the existing statute.
Any other quick closing observations? I wish we could go on because many other questions I want to put on the table, but okay. Thank you all for joining us. This was really an all-star group of people, and appreciate your joining.